Chapter 21, Thieves in the Night. "Who's down there?" asked Fairy Godmother, holding her wand high in the air like a torch and walking closer and closer to the speedboat. "Quick, hide!" said Mal, and the four of them scrambled to find the nearest hiding place. Jay and Carlos dove under the seats while Mal and Evie crouched behind a few containers. "Do you think she saw us?" Carlos asked worriedly. His heart was pounding rapidly under his black and white leather jacket. "I hope not," said Mal, crouching down even lower in the shadows. "I swear I heard something," said Fairy Godmother, sending beams of light everywhere. The lights arced over the boat they were hiding in, but no one moved, so it danced over to the next boat. Carlos breathed a small sigh of relief. "I guess I was wrong," muttered Fairy Godmother, and she walked back toward the shuttered yacht club at the end of the dock and began waving her wand again, making the windows sparkle and giving the building a new coat of paint. "What's Fairy Godmother doing down here anyway?" Evie whispered. "It looks like she's working on the Royal Yacht Club," said Mal. "Ben's parents are returning from their cruise, and I think that's where they're planning to hold the welcome reception. I heard the work on getting the place up to snuff was behind schedule." "How long is she going to be here? My legs are getting cramped," complained Jay. "Shh," said Mal. They watched as Fairy Godmother unfurled giant banners with the Oridon crest and gave the yacht club sign a little more sparkle. "There," said Fairy Godmother. "That should do it." She began walking away from the dock and back to the harbor entrance. Carlos found he could breathe again. If they had been caught stealing this royal speedboat, they would be in so much trouble. It felt as if his stomach had dropped into his shoes ever since he heard their head mistress's voice. Mal poked her head up to check, and there was no sign of Fairy Godmother anywhere. "I think she's gone," said Mal, she said, stepping out from behind the boat's containers. The rest of them came out from their hiding places. Evie hugged herself with her arms, and Carlos still looked uncertain. Only Jay appeared unfazed. "Let's give it a little more time," suggested Evie. "Good idea," said Carlos, who was not in any rush to get moving. They waited a little while longer, sitting in the dark and listening to the waves slosh gently against the sides of the boat. When Mal was satisfied Fairy Godmother had left the harbor, she nodded to the team. "Okay, let's go," she said, tapping the steering wheel as she muttered the words of the spell, and the boat's engine roared to life once more. Alas, a second later, the entire dock was flooded with light, and this time Fairy Godmother caught them boat-handed. "Aha! I knew there was someone here," said Fairy Godmother triumphantly. She walked down the narrow dock, pointing her wand at the perpetrators. "Mal, Jay, Carlos, and Evie, what are you four doing down here, and with the royal speedboat?" she gasped. "Are you stealing it?" "It certainly looks that way," thought Carlos. "Fairy Godmother, we can explain," said Mal. "Yes, we were, said Carlos as he vainly tried to come up with a plausible explanation as to why they had trespassed onto the royal dock. But Fairy Godmother shook her head, her lips a tight line. She kept her wand trained on the four of them and herded them away from the shoreline. "Shush! I don't want to hear it until we're safely back at school." She bundled all the four villain kids into her van and drove them to Oridon Prep. They sat in silence in the back seats, miserable and scared. "What do you think they're going to do to us?" whispered Carlos from the third row. "A lot of detention," Mal whispered. That can't be too bad, right? We'll just have to bake a lot of cakes." "Hopefully she won't send us back to the Isle of the Lost," said Jay. Evie squeaked. "She wouldn't do that, would she?" "She could," said Mal. "Oh, no," said Evie. "I don't want to go back there." "But it's home," said Mal, trying to soothe her friend. "It wouldn't be that bad." "Mal, don't you understand? Oridon is my home now," said Evie, looking out the window at the array of lights from the sparkling castles that dotted the landscape. Carlos nodded. He couldn't go back to the Isle of the Lost, not after everything they had seen and done in Oridon. The thought filled him with heavy dread. He couldn't go back to scrubbing his mother's bunions. He wouldn't. "No talking back there," said Fairy Godmother from the driver's seat, "and no talking on your phones either." And with a flick of her wand, all their phones disappeared. When they got back to the campus, Fairy Godmother marched them in front of her, holding the wand at Jay's back at the end of the line. The hallways were full of students heading to dinner. Carlos thought longingly of his life in Oridon, convinced that this was the end of the tale. He hadn't even been able to say goodbye to Dude. The school would not look kindly on thievery, or was it grand larceny? Marine larceny? Worse, it was exactly what the good people of Wardon expected from a few villain kids. Except they weren't villains anymore, not at all, and they were only stealing the boat so they could help a friend. But what was that saying? About the path to darkness. It was paved with good intentions. A few students looked at them curiously, but no one said hello, as Fairy Godmother had a very angry look on her usually cheerful face. One student wasn't deterred, however. Jane spotted them on the way to Fairy Godmother's office. "Mom," she said, stopping in her tracks. "What's going on?" Carlos's heart lurched once more, this time with hope. Maybe Fairy Godmother would listen to Jane. Jane could make her understand they weren't doing something evil. He was about to answer her, but Fairy Godmother didn't give him a chance. "Nothing, dear. Get out of the way," said Fairy Godmother, brushing off her only child and striding to the front of the pack. "This doesn't concern you." But Jane wouldn't be dismissed so easily. She fell in step with the four kids. "What happened?" asked Jane. "Why's my mom so mad?" Jay looked glum. Mal shook her head. "I don't want to get you in trouble, too," she said. "Evie, what's wrong? Are you crying?" asked Jane as they kept walking up the stairs. Evie sniffled but didn't answer. They reached the landing and Fairy Godmother unlocked the door to her office. She tapped her wand and motioned the villain kids to enter. Jane caught Carlos's sleeve before he disappeared behind the door. "Carlos, what's the matter? What did you guys do?" "Help us," Carlos whispered urgently. "I think they're going to kick us out of here." "Kicked out," said Jane, so aghast that she almost dropped her books. She stared at Carlos, shocked and wide-eyed at the very idea. "But you guys can't leave." "We don't want to leave," he said, feeling as terrible as he looked. "I'll figure something out, I promise," said Jane. "You guys aren't going anywhere." He smiled his thanks and reached for her hand. Jane gave it a squeeze, but had to let go as Fairy Godmother pulled Carlos into the room. It was too bad their little Ordon experiment was ending already, thought Carlos. He would have really liked to spend more time in Jane's company. Chapter 22, A Pirate's Life. Outside on the dock, Harry was gathering the pirates together, slapping backs, readying the crew for the voyage ahead. Their merry band was ready, polishing swords and greedy for treasure. Once they had found the trident and they were off of the Isle of the Lost, there was all of Oradon to pillage. The thought brought them all much wicked glee. "I heard in Agrabah there are warehouses full of the Sultan's gold," said Desiree. "Don't forget the jewels we'll find in the summer lands by the dwarf mines," growled Gonzo, his eyes going starry at the thought. "Olympus is mine," said Bonnie. "Pirates," Harry smiled. They were itching for adventure. First the trident, after, the world was theirs for the taking. Inside, from the window of her small apartment above the fish shop, Uma felt a grim satisfaction as she looked at her reflection in the mirror. The time had come. It was so close she could feel it. This was the start of her revenge, the start of her ascendancy. No more tiny room, no more apartment drenched in fish stink. She didn't need a fancy limousine to fetch her off the island. She would do it herself, cut her own deal, make her own way. "I'm leaving, Ma," she yelled, and a slender blue tentacle crept around from behind the door and splashed her with a few drops of water. It was the only goodbye she expected, the only one she needed. She was off to find herself. Her past would soon be nothing more than a memory. She clambered down the stairs, saying goodbye to all, to that step that wobbled and the patch of mold that could never be washed from the ceiling corner. She strode through the door and out onto the deck. Her ship lay waiting, the crew snapping to attention when she arrived in their midst. Uma regarded them with pride. Just that morning she had had nothing but slow-burning frustration and a jealous rage. But tonight she had so much more. She was a captain of a ship with a first mate and muscle to boot, as well as a crew of the toughest pirates on the island. Her name was Uma, and before long everyone in Oradon would know who she was when she lifted that trident and demanded her freedom. The first part of her plan had already worked perfectly. Sophie had crumbled like a piece of cake when Uma had threatened to set fire to the sorcerer's hat, and she had given up the necklace's secret location as soon as the flames had licked the brim. "Ready?" Uma asked Harry. In response, Harry gave her the usual pirate salute, which was no salute at all. He cocked an eyebrow and grinned. "Ready?" He raised his hook, which had been polished to a high shine. It gave him an air of malevolence that she quite liked. Gil, she said. Yes, shrimp, Uma, said Gil. And, do you think we can grab dinner after this? I'm hungry. Let's go, said Uma, ignoring him and leading the way. The motley crew headed down the wharf toward the Lost Revenge. They shambled past the rope bridge and toward the decks of the pirate ship, setting about unfurling the sails, hoisting up the jib, and removing the ropes that held it to the deck so that it would be ready for launch. Uma climbed the steps of the forecastle and turned to face the heavy wooden rail. The foremast stood at her back, ropes flanking her on two sides. The crew gathered on the main deck. The ship was ready to sail. She drew her sword from its scabbard, the blade flashing yellow and orange in the evening light. This was her crew, her people. Time to put them in order. Pirates! Somewhere on the Isle of the Doomed is a treasure chest that holds the pieces of a necklace that belonged to my mother. If we find it, I can call that fool Triton's trident from the sea and use it to win our freedom from this island prison. Are you with me? Arr! Cried the pirates. A few grunts followed, and a shrug or two. In pirate terms, it was good enough reception. Uma slashed the air with her sword. We ride with the tide, she cried. We ride with the tide, roared Harry, raising his sword just as high. We ride with the tide, said Gil. He shrugged his shoulders, removed his cutlass, and waved it in the air like the rest of them. The rest of the pirates joined in, raising their blades and cheering in unison. Harry took hold of the wheel and kicked off the motor that would power the ship until the wind took hold. The Lost Revenge solemnly pulled out of the dock and into the dark waters beyond. A curious crowd gathered by the harbor to watch it as it pulled away, tossing rotten tomatoes at the ship's bow and the usual Isle send-off. Harry steered the ship out past the shattered lighthouse, and through the fog he could make out the barrier over the Isle of the Lost and the waters surrounding it. But they had room to move, and when they reached the street of Ursula, the wind blew and the sails plumped at last. But the oceans were choppy and high, slamming the ship's hull. They ran right into one, sending a spray of water onto the deck, but Harry laughed as he peered through the mist, and the crew seemed to take it all in stride. At last they were off. Uma smiled, for once utterly gratified with how her life had turned out. She had her ship and her crew, and they were sailing to find their freedom. Chapter 23, Sail Away. Contentment didn't last long. Harry, is this as fast as we can go? She asked. The Lost Revenge had only sailed a few yards, and the dock was still in view. They had inched up the archipelago, but they were still miles from where they needed to be. She paced the deck impatiently. First the necklace, and then the trident was theirs for the taking, if only they could get there faster. It only goes as fast as the wind will take it, said Harry. Sorry. Right, said Emma. I get it. The wind hissed the sails, and off we go. She looked up at the billowing white cloth. A single swatch of linen fluttered in the wind, held there 4 ropes and tied to the foremost mast. But just behind it were not just one, but 2 others. What do you call those other masts? She asked, acting a bit coy. Oh, yes, he replied, a bit sheepish. That's the main mast, just behind the foremast, and the one in the back is called the mizzen. I see. And these masts have sails as well, she asked, still acting coy. The boy had to know exactly where this was going, right? He told her he knew how to sail, didn't he? Yes, I mean, technically, we do have 3 masts, he allowed, and each one has a sail or 2. 3, actually. So why in the world aren't we using them all? She yelled. Well, it's the waves, you see. With all this rocking, it would be quite dangerous to go up there and unfurl the rest of the sails. So you're telling me we could be going 2, 3 times this speed, and all we have to do is climb up there and unroll the rest of the sails? Something like that, said Harry. It's not as easy as it sounds. Try climbing 50 feet into the air while the boat is pitching to and fro, and see if you can hold on. These things, I think I will, she said. She was heading toward the second mast before he could make any further attempt to dissuade her from climbing it and wrestling with the sails. How hard could it be? She thought. Climb the mast, untie some ropes, and it's done. She looked at Harry with disdain, and she raised her foot and caught hold of the first peg. She grabbed one and then another, and soon she was 7, 8 feet in the air. The ship rolled, and her face promptly collided with the mast. Her hand slipped from one peg, her leg from the other, and she reeled. Were it not for the fact that her shirt had caught on yet another of the pegs, she would have fallen onto the deck, or worse, she might have landed in the ocean itself. Harry snickered. I suppose this is that moment when you mutter, I told you so, she asked. I might have, said Harry, but you've gone and ruined it. I suppose I'll have to come up there and help you out. It does take two to unfurl a sail. You know that, don't you? She didn't. She hadn't the faintest idea how any of this worked. She only wanted to get to the Trident as quickly as was possible, and if that meant a bit of mast climbing, she'd do it. She had already made it past the hardest part, right? The boat leaned in answering her question. This time she was ready, though, and wrapped her arms tightly around the mast. She wasn't going to let her feet slide from the pegs a second time. Harry was snickering again. She had half a mind to stab him when he reached her. He held one peg tightly, balancing himself. You're going to squeeze that mast in two if you hold on to it any tighter, he said. She immediately loosened her grip and regained her composure. So tell me how all of this works, she ordered. Each time the ship rocked, the mast swayed wildly, hurling them through the air. Like being launched from a slingshot, she thought, her hands wrapped a bit more tightly around the pegs again. At this height, there were rope ladders too, a great number of ropes actually, all of them running back and forth between the mast's various arms. There was more to grab onto, more to catch if she fell. She supposed she was a little bit safer at this altitude, but who knew? See that rope? Harry pointed to a tightly wound bit of cord. Unwrap it on your side, and I'll do the same on mine. Just hold the last little bit. Don't let the whole thing loose, he said, but she had already unwound the rope. It was easy enough. She simply pulled the rope from the sail and cast it off. Unfortunately, Harry hadn't even started to unfurl his end of the rope, so the end that she had set free caught the wind, jerking the boat toward its starboard side, which was a boating term that Harry would not stop using. Isn't it just called the right side? She had thought over and over, but now the word was in her head and she was using it. This would have been a lot easier if you had waited, Harry said grumpily. Got that, she said. The boat was turning rapidly to one side, threatening to pull them off course. But Harry was quick, his fingers nimble. The sail pulled at the ropes, tightening them, but somehow he had managed to get the rope unwound, and the entire sail billowed gorgeously into the air. The ship righted itself. Next time we do it together, he exclaimed, and Uma made no argument. She was eager to get to the necklace and the trident, but she had already twice seen where a bit of over-eagerness had gotten her. She had nearly fallen into the drink, as pirates called the sea, and partially driven them off course. I think it's time to listen to directions, she thought. Uma hated directions. She gave orders, she didn't follow them. But she climbed to the next sail as Harry directed. This one had a plank behind it and a rail, so it was easier to balance as she undid the ropes. Wait, said Harry. I know, I'm not an idiot. He raised an eyebrow. Now, he cried, and they both let loose the next sail. This one blossomed into a perfect half circle, snapping tight in the wind. They undid one more, and then moved to the rear, where they had 3 more sails to unfurl. All in all, it was a lot of work, but each time a sail caught the wind, she felt their speed increase. By the time they had unfurled the last of them, they were moving at quite a clip, the boat dashing across the waves, sometimes almost skipping from peak to peak. See, that wasn't so bad, she said as they climbed down the last mast, the mizzen mast, as he called it. You did nearly fall into the ocean, Harry reminded Uma. Twice. The boat rocked once more, as if it too were reminding her of what happened. It swung back in the other direction, and both of them spun, catching each other and holding on to the mast to avoid falling into the ocean. The increased speed had also added a bit more instability to their ride, making it slightly more dangerous. When the boat rocked, it did so with incredible force. It pitched again, and even Harry was fumbling for something to hold on to. Fortunately, sailing ships were webbed with ropes. He caught one or two and steadied himself. Lost your sea legs? Uma asked. Even a good sailor needs a handhold every now and then. She nodded as if she didn't believe a word he had said. Oh, stop it. Don't we have a treasure chest to find? Harry pointed out. They did. She had almost forgotten about it. Uma stared over the ocean. She knew the trident was there, and she also knew she wasn't the only one looking for it. But they were moving faster now, and she had to hope that they would find it first. That's all the sails? She asked. That's it. I can throw an oar in the water if you want to paddle. I'll let you do that, she replied. I'm sailing the ship, Harry said, and indeed, he was moving back and forth, checking all the ropes and wound from the gunwale to the masts, from mast to mast, and from mast to sail, and all the while he had to make certain that the rudder was set in the right direction. He had fastened it in place with a lash, but it needed constant correction. If you don't head straight into these waves, they can knock you over, leaving you on your side, and then you're done, he said. The sea is growing tougher, the waves are certainly higher, and the wind stronger. I hope this trident of yours is worth all the effort. It is, trust me, said Uma. With the trident we can buy our ticket out of here. Harry shrugged. I hope so. We're all counting on it.